Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, we're taking a day trip through the land of virtual data. The goal of virtualization is to display large sets of data as efficiently as possible, retrieving small chunks on demand, giving the end user the illusion that all the data is at their fingertips, yet only getting what is needed to be displayed as it's needed to be displayed. In .NET 5, Microsoft introduced a Blazor component called Virtualize. Daniel Roth actually showed it to us in episode 23. Virtualize is a container displaying items in a list, but rather than requiring all the data to be loaded before the page renders, Virtualize asks you for the data that it needs to satisfy the requirements of the UI as the user scrolls through the data. So I'm first going to make the case as to why we need virtualization in some scenarios, and then I'll show you a few tricks with Virtualize. By the end of this episode, you'll be taking off like a bullet train down the tracks to efficiency town. Man, the metaphor is getting old, isn't it? Well, anyway, that's all coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. All right, so here we go, guys. I've got a brandy new Blazor WebAssembly application that's hosted. You can see I've got my 3 projects here. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a model, because everything starts with a model. I'm going to add that to the shared project. It's called Person. Now, Person has an ID, a first name, a last name, and a bio. Just some stuff to show, and also a photo URL, which I've hard-coded to this generic person PNG. So let's add that guy to the project right over here. That's going to go in the client web root. And of course, because it's in the web root, I have to make sure that I tell Visual Studio to include that in the build. Copy if newer. All right, so we need some data, and I'm not going to use a database because that just complicates things. So what I'm going to do is add a little console application that generates some data using the famous lorem ipsum set of words. And just let me do this here. I'm going to add a new project, and it's going to be a .NET Core console app, and we'll just call it Create Items. Now, Create Items, some reason, is defaulting to .NET Core 3.1. I want this to be .NET 5, so I'm going to change the target framework right there. Not sure why that happens. I mean, this is a .NET 5 project. Don't know. All right, so Create Items needs to have access to that model, so we'll add a project reference to Virtualization Demo Shared. And now, the code. So I borrowed this lorem ipsum generator and modified it. And I didn't look too far into who did it, but there's the URL right there if you want to go out and check it out. Now, it is in Codeplex, which has been archived, but, you know, there it is. So essentially, we've got, you know, the generator here. We've got the lorem ipsum dolor blah 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 strings, and we're telling it how many words we want, the paragraph length, and all of that. So then I also have modified the random string array tool that was included with this project to just randomly pick stuff. All right. So needless to say, this is the real code right here. I'm going to create 5,000 generic person records. We want a large data set because that's what this is all about, dealing with large sets of data. So I got a for loop 5,000 times, create a new person. The ID is just going to increment starting at 1. And the first name and last name, I'm just going to pick a random single word from the Latin. And bio, I want 50 words. So I also have a couple things to clean up and capitalize the first letter for the first name and the last name. And I'm also capitalizing the first letter of the bio, just little stuff. All right, so now I have my people. I serialize that into JSON, and I save that in the current directory to people.json. So we'll set that as the startup project and run it. Done, 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 done. All right, now let's go find that data file and copy it to the server project. There it is right there, people.json, copy to the server. All right. And we're going to go back to the server, making that, again, the startup project. And we don't need any of this anymore. And now we're going to start on the server side. We're going to leave the client side alone for a minute. We're going to start with a manager in a folder called data. And this is going to be called persons manager. All right, leaving aside what's up here for a second, let's just take a look at this. So in the constructor, I'm loading up that people.json file, and I have a publicly accessible list of person called people. So now there's this stuff with locking and total records. In my demo, I'm going to show from the server side with a console write how many records have been retrieved since we clicked on the page. So that's what I'm doing here because singletons aren't thread safe. I'm going to make this a singleton so there's only one copy of data. We're just going to wrap this in some locking logic, when we return the total records. Also, when we increment the total records, we're adding so many to it. We're locking it there. And when we reset, we're going to do that anytime we change pages. You'll see we're going to set it to 0, but it all has to be locked. Okay. Now let's get to the controller. Here's the API controller. All right, our persons controller injects a persons manager, and that's going to be a singleton. We'll get to that in a second. Yeah, we're going to start with a get all, right? I'm going to return in the first demo 5,000 records. It's about 10 megabytes. That's how big this file is right here. And we're going to return it all and see how long it takes to make the case for virtualization. Now I have an endpoint to get a single record by ID. And you'll notice that here I've got this total count, which I'm incrementing, right? And then I'm showing on the right line, I've got a little doodah there. And then I'm showing in the console window that we retrieved this record and the total count. Actually, I'm not even going to end up calling this, but you'll see that we're going to use this same total count reporting thing. So here we're getting the count. Here we're resetting the count. Get range is something that we can say we want from the start ID to the end ID, and these are the IDs, the numeric IDs themselves, the keys of person, and that's pretty easy to understand. We increment the count with how many people came back, and then we say retrieved record start ID to, and then result last ID, because you might want to, it might want to retrieve records 4,999 plus 20, and of course there isn't anything past 5,000, so it's only going to return up to 5,000. So that would be 2 in this case. And get by IDs is another one where you can actually pass a list of integers, a list of IDs. They may or may not be consecutive, but it will return all of the person objects that match the IDs in that list. So we're going to be using all of these things. Now, I told you we need to make this a singleton, so let's go do that. And there's another thing we need to do too. And for this, I've got a tip. All right, and here's the tip. First of all, you can see I've added persons manager as a singleton, but I've also changed add controllers with views to add these JSON options to set the property naming policy to null. And it's not very clear what that does, but if you don't do this and you just use the default JSON stuff in the controllers, you're going to get back JSON property names with camel casing. So first name won't be capital first name, it'll be camel cased first name. And the end result is, I don't know what to do with that. On the client, it doesn't map to anything. I don't know why this is happening, but it is just something that I noticed, and that is the fix. And that's your tip. All right, now we're done on the server. Let's go to the client, and we're going to add a services folder. And to that, we're going to add an API service class. All right, here's the API service. We're injecting HTTP, which we need to grab. It's been pre-configured in program CS so that it automatically uses the base URL for our project. And here's my get all. It's pretty simple. Here's my get person by ID, my reset record count, my get persons count, get range, start ID, end ID, and get by IDs, which is actually a post. If you remember, get by IDs, and we're passing that list. All right, so the next thing we need to do is add the API service to program CS as a scoped service. Add our using statements to imports razor. And now we can start getting some data. Let's go to the index page and hijack that as I always do. All right, so looking at the code, I've got my list of people. I've got a Boolean loading, and I've got a load people. Now, why am I not getting the data in the onInitialized async override? Well, the reason is I want to make a clear distinction as to when load people gets called, when the data gets actually called, so that I've got a button on click load people so we can see the time it takes from when I click the button to when the records show up. So I got loading equals true, and I'm saying state has changed because that changes what shows on the page. And I'm calling my get all from the API service. And then if we do have people, I'm going through each of those, and I'm showing a div with the first name, the last name, the bio, the photo URL. And if I'm loading, then I just say loading. Otherwise, I'm not loading and I don't have people, so that's the default. I'm going to show that button. All right, so let's see how long it takes to download 10 megabytes of objects, 5,000 objects, and put them essentially on the page in a list. Here we go, load people. Noonie, 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 noo. Noonie, noo, noonie, noonie. Wow. Okay. That took what? 6, 7, 8 seconds, something like that. Almost 10 seconds. And now you can see that I've got all the data on the page, 5,000 records. Let's, just for fun, let's pull up the task manager and see how much memory Edge is taking up right now. There it is right there. 442 megabytes. Wowzers. And maybe for comparison, we can run this again and see what it is before we press that button. All right, 149. So, geez, 300 megabytes added to the browser's DOM just by loading all that data. So it's slow and it's a lot of memory, and that is why you need virtualization if you're going to do this. Now, brings me to my next question. Why are you actually loading 5,000 records in a browser? Does your user get any benefit to seeing 5,000 records all at the same time? And the answer most of the time is no. But sometimes you get those customers and they just want to know that the data is there and they want to be able to scroll through it. And so that's the case. That's what we're doing. We're dealing with large data sets. So we're going to add a virtualized page, which uses the new .NET 5 Virtualize component to sort of make this faster and more efficient. Here's our virtualized page. Before we go any further, I'm going to update my nav menu with all of the pages, links to all of the pages that we're going to have. Here's the brute force page, the index, our virtualized page, and we're going to do caching after this. So let's go to the virtualized page. All right, so the virtualized component accepts a context, and you can see I'm setting that to person, and that is the model that we're using. But it's also the context, so I can use @person to access the data on that person, and I'm also telling my div that the key is person.id. And that's important if you're using Virtualize, to give whatever your container is for your object a key. So that's about it. Now we have this placeholder here which has the same styling as my div above, but it just says loading. And you might see that flash on the screen when it's loading something. It's going to get the next records. But the key here is ItemsProvider. And ItemsProvider is a method. Load person's virtual is what I have it set to. And this returns a value task of ItemsProvider result of person and passes the request. I've got this last person ID and records to read. Records to read is the number of records I want to retrieve each time, and I'm setting it to 20. And last person ID is going to be 5,000. It's how many records are in the total set, and we need to tell Blazor what that is. So let me get the rest of this method on the screen. All right, so if the last person ID equals 0, that means we haven't yet retrieved it. So I'm resetting the record count on the server. Remember, I told you I was keeping track of how many records are read. And so last person ID is 0 because we've initialized this page. We've navigated to it. So then I'm calling getPersonsCount to return last person ID. So that should be 5,000. Now I have the start ID, which is the request start index, which is 0 based. So I'm going to add 1 to it. And then last ID, I add records to read. And then I call getRange on my API, the start ID and the last ID. And now I'm returning a new ItemsProvider result of person, passing people, which is my which is what I got from the API, and the last person ID. So let's see that working. So we go to Virtualize, and the first thing you notice is, boom, it comes right up. Now let's monitor what the server is spitting out for records read. So there you go. You can see that 21 records have been loaded. And just so that you can see this, I'm kind of in front of it. I'm going to take myself out of the picture. Now watch this number total 21 as I move down. So I'm scrolling down, and now all of a sudden, boom, some more records have been loaded. Right? But you didn't really notice it. Right? It's just scrolling down. Now, one thing I want to point out is if I press end, now we've got the bottom of the list, right? 4987 to 5,000, but we've only loaded 224. And now if I press home to go back to the top, it goes and gets 1 to 21 again. Okay? It's fast, but it's reloading stuff that it has already loaded. All right, so there is the simplest way to virtualize data. It's not cached, but it is virtual. So you're going to end up maybe getting records again where you're scrolling around, but at least you're not grabbing them all at the same time. Now let's move on to caching. I'm adding a page called Cached. Okay, so everything here at the top is the same. I'm virtualizing. I'm not doing anything different there. However, my load persons is now called load persons cached, and I've got some neat things going on here that I want to show you. So the same way that we were loading last person ID, if it's 0, we're doing that. And now I've got my people, which is my list of person, where I was just returning that. Now I'm creating a new list, and I've got to add stuff to it. So I've also got this dictionary. You can see that right at the top, right? Dictionary int person people cache equals new dictionary int person. It could be a list, but dictionary just makes it easier. So this is going to be my cache. And essentially what I want to do is go through each of the items, start ID to last ID, and look to see if it's in the cache. And if it isn't cached, I'm going to add it to my IDs list because I've got a new list of ints. Otherwise, if it is in the cache, I'm going to pull it out, which try get value does, and I'm going to add it to the return list. So what about the ones that aren't in the cache? Now I have to go retrieve those, and that's why I made get by IDs. And get by IDs, essentially, we pass that list of the ones that were requested but not in the cache. And then we're adding them to the return list, people, and to the cache at the same time. All right, so it's a little bit of logic, but the end result is pretty interesting. Let's take a look. Boom, comes right up, of course. And you can also see if I get myself out of the way here, and if I zoom in here, you can see that we've retrieved 20 items total. And as I scroll down, just like before, I'm going and I'm getting just the records that aren't in the cache. But you can see here now it's like, oh, I got 20 records, then I got 15 records, then 4 records, right? So it's a little bit more efficient. It's only getting the things that aren't in the cache. And if I go down to the bottom by hitting end, now I've only got 87 in the cache. But if I hit home, look at that. I haven't gone back and got any more records. 0 records, right? So and as I go through this, of course, it's going to pick up more, but I only need to go through it once to get them all. Now I'm going to lean on the page down and watch what happens. That's pretty freaking fast, isn't it? Right? Whew. So there you have it. The next thing I'm going to do is bring in a friend of mine from DevExpress, Don Webier, to show us what they do with virtualization in their Blazor controls. All right, well, as promised, Don Webier is here from DevExpress. Hi, Don.
Hi, Carl.
And we've just seen a couple of ways that we can use the Virtualize component in Blazor 5. But it's interesting that when you have a third-party tool like a data grid, you want to do some editing, something more than just list items, that control can't necessarily work with this Virtualize component, and probably isn't going to. But you guys have put your own virtualization into your data grid, for example. So that's what we're going to show here.
Yeah, you're totally right. The grid is not a good candidate to pack inside this Virtualize component. Well, like you said, we already have our own virtualization mechanisms in place. And yeah, if you take a look at our data grid, you'll see that we have several ways of doing so. And yeah, let me guide you through how to set this up with the data grid to fetch the data whenever it needs to. And it can do a bit of more tricks as well if you've set it up properly. So,
all right. Well, the first thing let's do is add the DevExpress Blazor tools to the project here. And if you're a DevExpress customer, you've been through this before. You get a private NuGet feed, and you can just go search for it. I'm adding this to the client project, by the way, but it also adds to the server project. I'm going to install DevExpress Blazor here. Just take a second. All right, so the next thing let's do is add DevExpress Blazor to Program CS on the client. And there's another step that we need to do here, which is in the web root index HTML. We need to add the style sheet.
Very important here.
Yeah, otherwise things look different.
Exactly.
All right, and also there's a few namespaces we need to add using statements for in imports, so we'll do that. And now we're all set up to use DevExpress. Well, I want you to sort of tell me what's going on with the stuff that I'm going to add next. And starting with the controller, we need to add some stuff to the person's controller to support the grid. So the first thing let's do is this model binder. And why don't you explain what this is while I'm making these, qualifying these namespaces?
Yeah. That data source load options is something that we send across from the client to the server, which holds all information like filtering, sorting, grouping, etc. And it needs to be like serialized over the wire. And we use this model binder to decode it again on the server so we can query our data store.
All right. So then the method or the endpoint is going to be an HTTP GET. And this load result is what's coming back, but it's also accepting a load options.
Yeah, that is the parameter that I was just referring to.
Right.
This action method receives this load option and it returns a load result. And this is a mechanism that we have already introduced in our DevExtreme product as well. We are bringing this same mechanism over to Blazor. So Web API knows that once that data source load options object is expected, it will use the appropriate model binder to decompose it into a real world object.
So this is sort of taking the place of, what we were doing here, get by IDs or get a range where we have a start ID and an end ID. There's more that you can do with your grid other than just get a range. You can filter and you can sort and you can do all that stuff. So all of that is encapsulated in this load options. And then you're using your own DevExpress data source loader, passing the load options and the entire people collection, and that will give you a result. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And the cool thing is that this also works if you are using an entity framework collection. So if you want to query out of a database, you can use entity framework or you can use our own XPO ORM tool. And the data source loader will, create an iQueryable to properly get that data out of the data store.
All right. That's pretty cool. So now let's add a method to API service to support this.
Yep.
And I'll have to qualify these things as well. Load results, data source load options. And of course, we'll just clean this up here. And also, this is an interesting thing because I noticed that in the controller, like we didn't specify a parameter here for load options, and yet it's coming through. What kind of diabolical magic are you wielding here?
What we are doing is that convert to get request URI, that method, that will basically append query string parameters to the get people DX. And that also works with that. If you use a Web API endpoint and you don't specify the pattern in the URL, it will also check those query string parameters. And it's being added as a query string parameter.
Right. So it's encoded correctly to go in the query string.
Yeah.
And you're confident that the query string won't ever be too long based on the options?
No, that will work. Yeah,
okay.
We have thought about that carefully, and that will work.
Well, let's see what happens here. I'll open the old nav menu and add a new nav link. There we go. And now let's add the page, and then we can talk about what you're doing there. So this is a DX grid demo page. All right, so let me remove this, and you can explain me what's going on here.
Yeah, so what's interesting to mention is that the first declaration with the DX data grid is that we specify a T, which is the model type that is bound to the data grid. So we know what kind of models we're dealing with. The second parameter, the custom data, is not a collection with items, but it is actually a call to a method. And the method is called getSomePeople.
Yeah.
And you have coded it correctly here. So what it does is it basically receives two parameters, which is a load options object. Yeah, so the same one we've been talking about on the server.
Mm-hmm.
And it can receive a cancellation token as well in case you want to abort the mission while it's transferring data. It will be canceled as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what we then do, well, we modify the load options to take 50 records with the first
just the first
fetch.
time.
Yeah. And then afterwards we're executing the getPeopleDX from the API service, where we pass in the load options as well as the cancellation token. And what you'll see is that it will fetch the data, only the data it needs.
And so does it cache the data also? Because that's a really important thing, as we've just seen, that if you're not caching, you can repeat, go get the same records that you have before.
Yeah, we have some mechanisms in place as well to do the combination that you did as well with the cached virtualization.
With a lot less code.
Yeah, it saves a bit of code. And remember that there can be one line less, which is the reset record count, but that's for testing
right.
only.
That's just for testing.
Basically
Sure.
You need 2 lines. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's crank her up and see what happens. There we go. All right. So what I'm going to do now is show the output from the server, and I'm going to remove myself from the picture. All right. So now you can see as I scroll down that I've got 218 records coming back from the server, and I keep scrolling. Right. Let's do the thing where we scroll all the way to the bottom. Boom. There's the 5,000, but I've only got 366. So what are some of the other things that we can do with this now?
Well, what's also quite cool is that if we have enabled the filter box on top. So if you would now, at the first name, if you would search for a first
let's just
name,
put in a couple of letters and tab off of it.
Yeah.
There we go.
And what you'll see is you might want to put a breakpoint in your web API so you can actually show the load options, what it contains.
Okay, let's do that again.
What you'll see is that the query will be sent over.
All right, so let's change this, and I'll just continue. We'll do another filter here. BA. I don't know. All right, so now we look at load options, and what should I see here?
There should be a filter.
Oh, yeah, there it is. First name contains BA.
Well, we can also use column sorting. So if you want to click on the header, you'll enable the sorting of that column. And also that will be done on the server as well, because it's all in that load options object being sent over to the API. Allow sort equals true. And
all right.
I think if you don't specify anything with the columns, you can sort all of them.
All right. So sorting 5,000 records, but virtualized. Let me step out of the picture here again and sort by first name. All right, so it's sorted on the server, but now I'm not returning all the records and sorting them here. I'm just getting a sorted version, virtualized. And you can see the numbers are all over the place because it's sorted by first name. That is really cool.
Yeah, and if you click the first name again, it will sort descending as well. And it'll do the same trick.
Wow, sure. Yeah. Nice. Very nice.
Yeah, this is one of the cool mechanisms that we have, and this is the combination with the load options object, which is sent across, and the data source loader method, or the class, the helper class that we have on the server, that will query the correct set depending on those load options. So that's a very powerful feature to do the virtualization as well.
Good stuff, Don. Thanks for helping me with this and showing everybody what you can do when you're DevExpress and you have access to all the little bits.
Yeah, you're welcome, Carl.
All right. Back to you in the studio, Carl. Well, I hope you learned something today. I know I did. I learned that the whole train shtick will only get you so far, but hey, I still get to do my job without wearing pants. Whoa, whoa! Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a trail!